Hello and welcome to the Master of Demon Gorge podcast. Today we're talking about Shusun Tong. Last week we talked about Lu Jia, the man who explained to Liu Bang, the founding emperor of the Han Dynasty, that he couldn't rule the empire from horseback, and then proceeded to provide the early Han Dynasty with a blueprint of governance. And I promised you then that this was the first of a mini-series of 3 episodes on early Han figures who are sometimes overlooked. So today, let's do part 2. Today, let's talk about another figure who helped to establish the way things were done during the early Han Dynasty. Today, let's talk about Shusun Tong. Unlike with Lu Jia, we have no clear idea of when Shusun Tong was born or indeed when he died. We know he was a student of Kung Fu, a 9th generation descendant of Confucius, and a significant scholar in his own right. Indeed, we know that Shusun Tong was also from what is now the province of Shandong, not too far from the home base of Confucius and his family. Sometime after Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, founded the Qing Dynasty in 221 BC, he recruited various scholars from across his empire to come and work for the government. Shusun Tong, because he had studied under a notable descendant of Confucius, was one of the scholars recruited to enter government. But, of course, the Qing Dynasty didn't last that long. In 210 BC, Qin Shi Huang died. And a year later, in 209 BC, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang launched the first rebellion against the Qing. At this time, Qin Shi Huang's son and successor, the second emperor of Qing, asked the 30-odd gathered scholars what to do about the rebellion. Almost all of them said that the imperial government could not tolerate a rebellion and must send an army immediately to crush it. But Shusun Tong disagreed. He argued that since the first emperor had confiscated all the weapons from civilian hands, this couldn't amount to a genuine rebellion, but was at most a criminal enterprise. And criminal gangs didn't call for military suppression, but only local police action. The emperor was pleased to hear this. Now he asked the other scholars, one by one, whether they considered this a rebellion or merely criminal activity. Some stuck to their tune of calling it a rebellion. Some switched to agree with Shusun Tong. Then the emperor arrested and jailed everyone who said it was a rebellion and promoted and rewarded Shusun Tong for saying otherwise. Obviously, this wasn't exactly a shining example of good governance. As they left the palace, the other, not jailed, scholars blamed Shusun Tong for sucking up to the emperor and telling a lie, although of course they themselves acquiesced in the lie. Shusun Tong replied, essentially, that the Qing government was obviously failing. He said what he said out of self-preservation, but he would be an idiot if he stuck around now. Even as he spoke, he packed up his bags, and then he was out. He ran from the capital and reached the county of Xue. At this time, the rebellious army led by Xiang Liang, uncle of Xiang Yu, who would later become the more famous rebel leader, had already taken the county of Xue. So here, Shusun Tong offered his services to Xiang Liang. Later, after Xiang Liang was killed, Shusun Tong served King Huai of Chu, the nominal leader of the rebels of the south, Then Shusun Tong served the aforementioned Xiang Yu, the great hero of his age, the arch nemesis of Liu Bang, the founder of the Han Dynasty. After Liu Bang defeated Xiang Yu in one battle, Shusun Tong went over to Liu Bang and entered his service. So, as you can see, Shusun Tong was a man of flexible morality. Or maybe, given the times in which he lived, given the rapidly shifting and impossible to predict political landscape, it would have been unfair to expect him to remain loyal to one king or one lord or one side throughout it all. Anyway, in front of Liu Bang, he initially dressed like a Confucian scholar. As we mentioned in the Lujia episode last week, Liu Bang initially disliked Confucian scholars, thinking of them as somewhat useless bookworms. Seeing this, Shusun Tong changed how he dressed. He began to wear the fashion of the former kingdom of Chu, the state that occupied southern China during the spring and autumn and warring states periods, in the area that Liu Bang was from. This pleased Liu Bang. Also at this time, Shusun Tong frequently recommended men to enter Liu Bang's service. But curiously, even though Shusun Tong himself had over 100 students, at this time he never recommended any of them for service. Instead, he recommended rough men, bandits, and criminals, desperados. His students were quite upset about this and cursed their own teacher behind his back. Shusun Tong heard about their grumbles and explained to them that they were still in a war. And in war, rough men, men of action, were more useful. This was not yet a time for intellectuals. But he promised them their time would come. And when the time came, he would recommend them, his own students. In 202 BC, Liu Bang fully triumphed over Xiang Yu. The Han Dynasty had won, and Liu Bang was now Emperor Gaozu of Han. Because Liu Bang was China's first peasant emperor, and because many of his officers and ministers were similar men from lower social classes, and many were the rough men or even criminals who were useful during the war, during the first years of the Han Dynasty, nobody had any court etiquette. Liu Bang himself had decreed the abolition of the complicated Qing Dynasty court protocols that he couldn't even follow. But the lack of a code of conduct meant that the early Han court was a disaster. In court, ministers who disagreed drew their swords at each other and threatened fights. At banquets, officers got drunk and screamed and shouted at each other and urinated behind pillars and generally behaved like the men on the wrong side of the tracks that they basically still were. Liu Bang was very annoyed about this lack of decorum. At this point, Shusun Tong came forward and offered his services. Confucian scholars couldn't help him conquer cities, but they could be useful now in instituting a system of etiquettes, if Liu Bang would permit him to bring in a group of scholars from Shandong, the homeland of Confucius. Liu Bang worried that any system might be too complicated. He reminded Shusun Tong that he as emperor would need to comply with the etiquettes as well, and he had no wish to learn anything too complicated. Shusun Tong promised that he could blend practices from all the preceding dynasties, always picking the simplest practices, the ones easiest to follow. So, Liu Bang gave him the go-ahead. Shusun Tong went to Shandong and brought back 30 or so scholars. A couple, though, refused to come with him, accusing him of lack of loyalty for having switched sides so many times. In response, Shusun Tong said they were too rigid in their ways and didn't know how to roll with the times. Anyway, Shusun Tong brought back these guys, who then joined forces with his existing students. And they came up with a series of court protocols for all the officials to follow. They even demonstrated everything to Liu Bang to reassure him that the court procedures they proposed weren't too complicated for an aging ruler to learn. In 200 BC, upon the completion of a new palace, all the courtiers and feudal lords from across the realm came to the capital to pay obeisance to the emperor. For the first time, per imperial decree, all the servants of the Han Dynasty had to adopt the new protocols invented by Shusun Tong and his guys. And the event was a great success. Everyone was able to follow the rules, and they no longer behaved like they used to, arguing and brawling with one another. Liu Bang was well pleased. Only now, he said, do I fully appreciate the pleasure of being emperor. He promoted Shusun Tong and rewarded him with much gold. Shusun Tong took the opportunity to talk up all the students who had stuck by him all these years. So Liu Bang gave them all jobs as well. In 198 BC, Liu Bang named Shusun Tong an advisor to his son, the crown prince. But in 195 BC, shortly before his death, Liu Bang considered replacing his son, the crown prince, with another son, born to his favored concubine, not his proper wife. Shusun Tong remonstrated with him, citing historical examples of political instability resulting from changing the crown prince, and talked him out of it. Never mind that, as the crown prince's existing advisor, Shusun Tong obviously had a vested interest in his guy becoming emperor, and not another imperial offspring. After Liu Bang died, the original crown prince became Emperor Huidi, and Shusun Tong continued as an advisor to the new emperor. But, like we talked about during the last episode, Liu Bang's wife, now widow, Empress Dowager Lu, came to hold the real power. She mutilated and killed her romantic rival, Liu Bang's favorite concubine. As for her son, whom Liu Bang considered naming the crown prince, the Empress Dowager had him poisoned and killed. He was 11 years old. Altogether, Shusun Tong was a figure of some controversy. As we already saw, even during his lifetime, some people considered him an immoral figure who sailed with the wind and was not above lying outright and telling those in power what they wanted to hear, rather than the truth. Some others felt that his flexibility was appropriate to his times. The controversy continued after his death on historians' pages. The great Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian arrived at a positive appraisal of Shusun Tong, saying that he was right to keep the big picture in mind and forget about the details of who was exactly right or wrong in a time of dynastic transition. The Song Dynasty prime minister and historian Sima Guang, on the other hand, took a negative view of Shusun Tong. Although Shusun Tong was famed for instituting the court protocols of the Han Dynasty, Sima Guang blamed him for putting in a hodgepodge of customs from earlier dynasties, making it difficult in later generations to figure out which customs really belonged to which periods. However we may feel about him, Shusun Tong was undoubtedly a survivor with a powerful political instinct. By surviving and flourishing, and then promoting himself as a Confucian scholar, he set the stage for the future, exalted status of the Confucians. In this, he was much like the subject of our previous episode, Lu Jia. And so, he was a second figure who helped to establish Han Dynasty culture, and therefore all Chinese culture to come. As we shall see in the next episode, a third figure would come along and complete this trifecta of early Han cultural personalities. On that note, this has been MODG. Thank you for listening.